Louisville, Kentucky is a big city and home of the famous Kentucky Derby. It's 1 o'clock in the morning and a fire call is reported to 911. A small apartment building is ablaze. The fire department responds. And they put the fire out. So arson investigators respond to these major fires to determine exactly how this began. As they examine the remains of the fire, there are multiple ignition points in the house, rags and clothing piled together. It becomes obvious to them that this fire was intentionally set.
Lieutenant, come check this out.
In this apartment, they discover human remains. Is this an accidental death? Is this someone who succumbed to smoke inhalation? Is it the person who started this fire? The arson investigator takes one step back and says,
"Call Metro. Tell them to get Homicide down here right away."
they're not a suspect, they're a victim. There is a large knife protruding from their face. Wow.
My name is Lee Maroney. I'm a retired detective from the Louisville Metro Police Department. I worked there for 20 years. At least 11 of those were in homicide. I was always drawn to the process of investigations, working with homicide victims who don't have a voice, who can't tell you anything about what happened.
Lee Maroney. She started late into law enforcement. She was 29 when she came on the job. Worked hard, got assigned to homicide, was under a strong light because she was a woman.
I was the only female there, so I always wanted to prove myself as worthy and capable. It's just by nature. At that point, I was in homicide for 2 years. 2 years sounds like a long time, but you really are just getting started.
I had rookie years too. She's learning, and this case will teach her a lot.
Dispatch requesting homicide at the 100 block of Harlan Avenue.
Copy.
On this particular night, I was working the 4 to midnight shift. I was at the top of the list for the next homicide, and I responded to the scene.
Lieutenant? So what have we got here?
We were briefed by arson investigators that they had located a body within the home, and it did appear that there was foul play involved.
If you die in a fire because the building burns and you are unable to escape, it's not an arson. No one intentionally burned it. It's an accidental fire. You are an accidental death, and it's the sole responsibility of the fire department to complete the investigation. However, if arson is determined, then it becomes a criminal event that someone died in the course of an intentionally set fire. Then when you observe weapons are involved, there's no question it's a criminal event. It is a homicide, and it becomes a police matter. So it moves from accidental fire in the hands of the fire department to intentional murder and into the hands of the police.
Is it safe to go in?
Air quality isn't great, but we should be all right.
Nothing worse than a fire scene. Even though the fire is out, the heat is so intense, it retains for long periods of time. So you're perspiring heavily, and you can barely breathe because of the odor. I've responded to a number of fire scenes involving deaths. Everything made by man contains petroleum products of some type. be they plastic or asphalt or rayon or nylon or whatever they are, they have an absolutely foul smell, a unique odor that permeates your clothing, even your shoes. I have thrown away everything I was wearing at a fire scene. You cannot recover the odor from the clothing or even the shoes, because you will smell it forever. You never forget the odor of death, ever. And you never forget the odor of burning flesh, human flesh.
Arson investigators took us to the body, which appeared to be laying on a bed face up.
Let's take a look.
It's hard to determine what exactly you're looking at. So we had to get a little bit closer at this point. Although we couldn't identify facial features, there was an obvious knife stuck in the face.
You ever see anything like that?
That was very, very unusual. Nothing I've ever seen before, and certainly nothing I've ever seen since.
Maroney's looking at this crime scene, and it also points out to her something that's important. This is extremely personal. The stabbing in the face is somebody wanting to eliminate you, to destroy your memory. It's pure hate that drives that.
And then after that, you look at the style of the knife.
Looks like a kitchen knife.
The person there armed himself with a weapon of opportunity, a kitchen knife. He sees, he looks for, he finds in a drawer, whatever, and he attacks the victim with it. So it's not a planned event. And now we have to unravel this. How did this person come to be here in the condition they are in?
All right. Let's go take a look around and see who this guy is.
In identifying this victim, we always want to start with who lives here. And in determining that, you look for mail and you look for personal items around the house.
Hey, you got anything back there?
Not much.
Guess that was the point.
Based on the evidence that we saw at the crime scene, with pages of books being torn out and scattered about the room in general, it wouldn't happen that way unless it was deliberate.
This is a concealment fire. Concealment fires are set by perpetrators to try to destroy evidence and destroy a body, which is incredibly difficult to do. You're trying to scratch up the dirt to cover up the evidence of your sins. And it's not going to work. It never does.
Hey, Sarge.
Yeah.
Check this out.
Fortunately, not everything was destroyed. We located a black book that waiters typically carry in restaurants. I waited tables, I recognized it immediately.
All right. Let's get this back for evidence.
So when Maroney is inside examining the scene, a very concerned citizen shows up outside.
Sir,
What's going
I
on?
can't let you in here. This is a restricted
This is
area.
my place.
My name's Daryl Benzel. My wife and I, we own about 3 homes, 4 units altogether. Harlan Avenue was one of our first. That night, my neighbor called to tell us that our house was on fire. So I rushed over there, and it was a devastating sight.
You gotta tell me what's going on. Is there anyone inside?
And he's like, yes. And I said, well, is he dead? And he's like, yes, he's dead. And I'm like, oh, Lord. And about that time, I saw Lee.
Daryl?
Chester 1960.
But hey, Daryl, what brings you here? And he informed me at that point that he owned the house.
I knew her father and brother, and then I met Lee, and we developed a friendship.
It's rare that you know a person as a witness, so it was unusual for me to see him. But once I did, I thought, well, great, I know him. He'll be comfortable speaking with me. I could probably get a lot of information from him.
How many people live here?
Just one. The rest of the units are all vacant.
Do you have a name?
Yeah, it's Eddie. It's Eddie Pointer.
I immediately recognized the name and that this was a person that I had actually met several months prior to this incident.
She looks back at these charred remains with a blade through its face and says, God, Eddie, what happened to you? It's bad enough to look at a stranger who's been violently killed. To look at somebody you know and you knew in life, it's just the worst feeling.
How'd you know this guy anyway?
He's friends with my brother. I actually met him not that long ago.
He was waiting tables in a restaurant called Cunningham's, and my brother and I happened to be eating there, and Eddie stopped by to say hello to my brother. I just know that Eddie made a big impact on my brother.
They were in AA together.
Eddie Pointer. He's had a long history of suffering from substance abuse, both alcohol and drugs. He joined Alcoholics Anonymous.
The AA program is all about helping someone get and stay sober. And so in this case, he had been sober quite a while.
Eddie was trying to get himself together, to be a lot more responsible. He tried to help others.
He became a sponsor for dozens of people. He has done a lot to come back from the abyss that he was about to fall into.
Every homicide victim I've encountered, I did not know. I knew nothing about them. So this was an unusual case for me, knowing that he had an impact, a very positive impact on people's lives. And it really did change my view of victims from then on. I didn't look at my victims as numbers. They just became human. One of the first things we do in a homicide investigation is what's called a neighborhood canvass, to see what the neighbors saw, what they heard, what they know.
Morning, ma'am. Metro PD. Just hoping you could answer some questions for me.
Okay, sure.
I worked for the Louisville Metro Police Department for 22 years before I retired. Sometimes you have certain cases that really pique your interest, and this is one of those cases. You have a fire that somebody tried to light and cover up the death. When you have a knife stabbed to the face, I mean, it's just aggression, uncontrolled aggression. And it's scary.
Morning, ma'am.
Hello.
Metro PD.
We went and did our canvass. We spoke with several people. They said that Eddie, he was a nice guy. He worked. I mean, I didn't hear a bad thing about him at all. There was nothing out there that would have caused somebody to come after him and kill him.
Because the injuries were to the face, I wasn't convinced that the knife wound itself was the cause of death.
You're not going to die if somebody plants a knife blade under your cheekbone. The odds are you're going to survive that 99 times out of 100.
So we needed to wait for the autopsy to give us the understanding of what exactly caused the victim's death.
So, what are we looking at?
Well, his lungs are clear, so it wasn't the smoke inhalation that killed him. Take a look at this.
Stab wounds are discovered, multiple wounds through the lungs, through the liver, through the abdominal aorta, all over the place. A blitz attack with a knife. Stab, 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 stab. And the final blow is the one in the face.
Homicide 101 is, any type of overkill situation or violence to that degree has an emotional component to it. Maybe he had a relationship with this person. Maybe he was a friend. So you start from there and you work out.
So it's now to the point to where Maroney has to notify the family of Mr. Pointer's untimely demise. She identifies a person, Faye Brown, who is the mother to Mr. Pointer.
His mom lived in a different city in Kentucky. They were a very close-knit family.
He didn't deserve this.
Brown tells Maroney that Mr. Pointer was born and raised in a small town in Kentucky, and that Eddie is gay. Initially, when Eddie Pointer was young, he had a child with a woman and didn't come out as gay until later in his life.
He grew up in Edmonton, Kentucky. That's part of the Bible Belt. And probably at that time when he was growing up, something you didn't come out and say.
Mr. Pointer felt it was important to move into a big city where there is a possibility of a more favorable environment for those who are homosexual. So he elected to move to Louisville for that reason.
Coming to the city, yes, he found a lot more opportunity to be happy or find other people that he wanted to be with.
So at this point, what we want to find out is who was responsible for Eddie's murder. Did Eddie have any significant relationships? What is he dating anybody? Who were his closest friends? Once notification is made to the family, news spreads quickly. I was contacted by Gary Perry. He was very close friends with Eddie, and that if there was any information that he could provide, he wanted to assist in this because Eddie was so dear to him.
This is where we'd usually see Eddie.
Pointer had a favorite spot where he liked to go.
It was a small hole-in-the-wall gay bar downtown, a little bit more homey than a busy dance bar.
Eddie was real quiet. He didn't drink. He just came for the company.
Gary said Eddie didn't socialize a lot, that he wasn't necessarily in a romantic relationship with anybody seriously.
The only person I ever see Eddie with was Blaine.
Gary explains that one of Pointer's best friends is a 73-year-old man who is also gay, whose name is Blaine Thacker.
Eddie and Blaine were both gay men in the restaurant industry and worked odd hours, and I think they just struck a friendship.
Just very, very good friends. I think Blaine took care of Eddie. When he was hard on his luck, Eddie lived with Blaine for a little bit, or on and off.
Maroney says, okay, so Blaine Thacker, have you seen him lately?
Come to think of it, he hasn't been in here lately either.
Is that unusual for him?
Yeah, I'd say it is.
When someone is doing something that's beyond their usual activities and they're associated with a homicide victim, that's a little worrisome. Why are you not in here like you always are? And your friend is dead. Did you have something to do with him?
So, Anna Masterson?
They go to the restaurant where Blaine Thacker works and find out some very interesting information.
I was looking for one of your cooks, Blaine Thacker.
I'm co-owner of Masterson's Catering, third-generation family business. Blaine worked for us for around 30 years, and we were very concerned when he didn't show up. Blaine was always there, always on time. He was early.
We called his house, no one answered.
We just kind of gave it benefit of the doubt. Maybe he'll show up later. But the second day he didn't show up, we knew there was something wrong.
So your best friend is dead and you're suddenly in the wind. Well, we're getting warmer.
Mr. Thacker, are you in there? It's Metro PD, open up.
It was concern to us, and so we went over to the apartment and had the manager open up the door for us. We went into the apartment.
Mr. Thacker?
We went into the back room. So you could see he was dead. Once we removed all the blankets, it was obvious that he had been stabbed numerous times.
It's this very similar method as to what is seen in Mr. Pointer. It is a blitz attack. Mr. Thacker has innumerable stab wounds in the chest, more than sufficient to kill him.
My jaw just kind of dropped and hit the floor. The last thing I expected to hear was that we have another victim.
It's not a coincidence. There's no such thing as coincidence. Louisville Metro homicide detective Lee Maroney has 2 homicide victims in the same night. Both have been brutally stabbed in the same manner. Could they be related?
It's not uncommon to have 2 murders in the same night, but it is uncommon to have them in such close proximity and the victims to be very good friends and to have similar lifestyle. Both Eddie and Blaine were gay men in the restaurant industry.
So we have a multiple victim homicide case and 2 separate events. Now we're talking about a very dangerous killer who is not in custody and not even identified.
I mean, if he killed 2, were there other bodies elsewhere? It really made us very concerned for the safety of other people in the city. And so it really kind of kicked up our case to a different level. We had to get this guy.
Maroney.
Detective Maroney gets a call from her partner, who's still at the first crime scene, who says he's found a witness there that he would like Maroney to speak to.
You got this?
Yeah.
So she immediately goes back to the scene.
Hey, Sarge. This guy says he's looking for a friend of his.
The subject's name was Charles Mullins, and Mr. Mullins stated that he had a friend that had been staying in the apartment with Eddie Pointer.
This is a shock to Maroney, because as far as she knows, Eddie Pointer was the only person living in this place. Who's your friend?
He identified his friend as someone he grew up with in Ashland, Kentucky, and his name was Dale Moneypenny. He stated that Dale had a friend or a girlfriend that was also there named Jennifer Smith.
His girlfriend was staying here too.
Yeah, as far as I know.
He says he just met that girl, Jennifer. I don't know her very well. She goes to college, I think.
I heard about the fire. Are they okay?
Well, they weren't in there.
Hey, Sarge, you got a second?
Yeah. Hey, do you mind finishing up?
The arson investigator came out and said, hey, we were going through some of the debris in the house, and we did find this notebook. And I don't know if you guys want it or not, but it has a name in it, Jennifer Smith.
The same name that our witness says he believes is Moneypenny's girlfriend. So now we have some evidence that Jennifer Smith at least had some of her possessions in this apartment.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So now Maroney's faced with a dilemma. Who are these people? How well do they know Mr. Pointer? Are they involved in this, or are they just not home when the fire occurs? It could be either one, but we need to find them.
At that point, we know Jennifer Smith, that's it. Very common name. It's like a needle in a haystack.
Jennifer Smith isn't going to be simple to find, but Mr. Moneypenny might be. How many Moneypennies are there? Probably not many. So if Detective Maroney runs the name through the system and all the lights brighten up.
We were able to pull a picture of Mr. Moneypenny. He was young, he was attractive, piercing blue eyes, but he had a criminal history. He liked to steal things. He liked to run from the police. He liked to resist arrest. He liked to assault people.
Also, they discover that he has a car registered to him.
All that we know is he drives a black Honda Accord, and he's originally from Ashland. So we made notifications to the police department in Ashland, Kentucky. We did put a flag through our NCIC system that if this license plate or this vehicle is seen, we are looking for this individual. A few days later, the car was located by the Louisville Metro Police Department. It was brought in for processing.
It was found abandoned on a city street in Louisville and was towed away as an abandoned motor vehicle. They still can't find Moneypenny, but they have found his car. And that car could lead him somewhere, so let's go see what's in it.
Jesus, what a mess.
And they look inside and they see drug paraphernalia, crack pipes that have been used, burned spoons, all that sort of thing. Now we have a whole new ballgame. Drug people will do anything to get their hands on drugs. Will they kill? Yeah, they will. Will they set fire to a place? Of course. No one understands what a demon you become when you become addicted to narcotics. You are no longer who you were. You're not like anyone else. You will do anything. There are no limits to what you will do to get your hands on drugs or the money to purchase them. You have no sympathy, no empathy, no anything. You are driven by one thing alone: the need for narcotics. It destroys you and everyone around you. It's playing Russian roulette with 5 cylinders loaded instead of 1.
The fact that the car was located empty told me that Dale either took a Greyhound bus, he stole a vehicle, or he's hooked up with a rat out of town.
Dale is in the wind, so where's Jennifer? What does she know about this or have to do with it? We don't know. We don't know. That common name is a complication.
Did you see this?
So this notebook has the name Jennifer Smith on it. It also has the name of the school. So Maroney's detectives contact the school.
Office of Admissions.
Yeah, Metro PD. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions.
Do you have a student named Jennifer Smith? Yes, we do. Does she live in Louisville, Kentucky? No, she does not.
We were ultimately able to determine that Jennifer Smith was staying with her mother over in Jeffersonville, Indiana.
So they send the local authorities in Indiana to her home to see if they can make contact. They don't find her there, so we are on the lookout in Indiana for Jennifer Smith, the elusive girlfriend of the even more elusive Mr. Moneypenny. She is, at a minimum, an important witness in this case.
Maroney.
A few days later, I got a call that Jennifer Smith had reached out to another police department in Indiana, stating that she knew that the Louisville Metro Police Department was looking for her.
She goes, I want to clear my conscience. I want to make this right.
Okay, I'll be right there.
Once you get a call like that, you drop what you're doing.
Jennifer Smith is a roommate to someone who's been murdered and then set on fire. She has a boyfriend who abandoned a car filled with drug paraphernalia that she undoubtedly has been riding in. And she has now crossed a state line into Indiana to get away from all of this.
Why don't you start by telling me about your relationship with Dale Moneypenny?
Well, he sort of just came out of nowhere.
Jennifer explains that she initially is overwhelmed by his beauty. The Moneypenny is so pretty, and she never had a boyfriend like this before.
She'd only known him about 10 days prior to this. They kind of met like on the street, brought together by drugs and alcohol. And we're both kind of living this same lifestyle, and they bonded.
He told her that they're gonna go on a crime spree. He's gonna con people out of their money. He explains to her he has this method by which he uses his appearance in his youth to make himself attractive to homosexual men because he knows he is. What he wants is their money. And they're gonna just buy drugs and have a good time and party on. They're gonna be the new Bonnie and Clyde. That sounds like one hell of an idea to her.
I don't think this was her nature. She doesn't have a criminal history, but I think she just got roped into something by a guy who had some control over her.
So how did the two of you end up hooking up with Eddie? We met Eddie at a gay bar. We needed a place to crash, so he let us stay with him for a few nights.
How long are you gonna be in town?
They met Eddie, a very nice man, welcomed them into his home.
You got any money?
Yeah, get a drink there, buddy.
Their plan was to stay there for a couple days, taking advantage of that situation.
So then, how did Eddie end up getting killed?
So she says, blurts out, I didn't do anything to hurt that guy. I just gave him the lighter to start the fire. Really, Jennifer? Well, that makes a big difference then, doesn't it? When she says that, she has their attention.
So Dale was the one who killed Eddie?
She wasn't aware that he was going to do that. But once everything got out of hand, she went along with it.
There's something else.
But what she says next really gets their attention.
She goes, oh yeah, she goes, there's another person that we did the same thing to.
I didn't know he'd kill that old guy, I swear.
What old guy would that be? Well, his name is Blaine Thacker.
Jennifer Smith told us that they knew Blaine Thacker because he was a friend of Eddie's and one of his closer friends.
She said, you know, we met him, went up to his apartment, he bought us some food.
I think her thoughts were, we're gonna go over here and get something to eat, figure out what the heck just went on, and where were we gonna go from here.
Dale and Blaine went into the back room. And Dale comes out. And he had blood on him.
What happened?
We have to go.
What did you do?
We have to go now.
I swear I never thought he'd take things that far.
Jennifer gave a lot of details. You know, it's not like somebody was lying. She's just being straightforward about everything that happened.
I think she knew she was in way over her head, and I gotta get out of this.
She says, I didn't want to go out like Bonnie and Clyde in a hail of police gunfire, so I went back to Indiana. And where did he go? Well, he said he was going to go to Miami, but he says a lot of things.
You have your suspect, and you also have Jennifer. So you got to figure out what you can do with Jennifer.
We arrested Jennifer Smith for complicity to commit murder and arson.
Jennifer Smith has given them what they want. the killer of two different people. And his name is Dale Moneypenny. Like the wolf who circles the herd, he looks for the young and the inattentive and the sick and the ones who present as a victim, and they become those.
Once we heard he was going to Florida, Lee did whatever she needed to do to get him indicted.
We did notify Miami-Dade County that he could be in their general area and that there were warrants for him through NCIC for the double murders. And as personal as it was for Dale to kill Eddie and Blaine, it became as personal for me to find him and make sure that justice was served.
Several weeks pass. There are two detectives in this town in Florida that are looking for someone in some other matter when they see this car driving erratically and they stop it. Dale Moneypenny is in the front seat. They run the name. He's wanted for murder. Well, hello, Dale. We've been looking for you, and now we found you.
Step out of the car, please, sir.
Criminals, when they have success committing their crime, begin to believe they're geniuses. They are all Professor Moriarty, by heaven, and there is no policeman in the world that's going to find them because they're so clever. And the next thing you know, he's over the hood of a car and he's in handcuffs, shocked that he has wound up there.
My understanding is that when Dale was down in Florida, he encountered older gay male in a bar, and they subsequently went back to a hotel room, at what point Dale Moneypenny tied him up, stole his credit cards, and stole his car.
Well, there's a big surprise. That's what he does. Mr. Moneypenny is arrested for unlawful flight to avoid prosecution, and he will be extradited to the state of Kentucky to answer for his crime.
Fugitive detectives went down and flew home with him.
You always feel better when you have somebody in custody, especially someone like that. It's a sense of relief, of accomplishment that you're able to catch them and get them locked up and off the streets.
Immediately after getting off the plane, they brought him to the homicide office, and we were ready, and we began an interview with him. I remember looking at him and just thinking, you know, he's just a kid. He did not ask for an attorney. He agreed to sit down and talk. He appeared to me to be tired of running.
All right, Dale. We aren't here to judge you.
We just want to know the truth.
You know, as a female detective, a lot of times you appear to younger suspects as a motherly type figure, and you're easier to talk to for them, especially about horrible things that they've done. It worked in this case.
All right. I can tell you what I know.
How about you start with Eddie Pointer?
Eddie.
Dale said that he needed a place to stay. Eddie opened his home to Mr. Moneypenny and allowed him and Jennifer to stay there. Moneypenny used his good looks and his charm to manipulate Eddie into giving him what he needed or wanted.
Hey, man.
Eddie, you got any money for me?
Look, Dale, I can't have you guys freeloading here anymore.
And now all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he said he was kicking us out.
Eddie had told him that he and Jennifer were no longer going to be able to stay in his house and that they were going to have to find another place to live. And that set him into a rage.
Do you understand me?
No. I don't think so.
He was so outraged that he turned around and killed him.
His rubber band breaks. Something in his head comes unplugged. What is that? I have no idea, but it does. And when it does, he is a raving banshee with a knife in his hand. Dale now comes back out of the ether of his rage and realizes this mess he's created. How are you going to stop the police from finding this? And he comes up with a genius idea of burning it down. That fire will fix it all. He gathers up clothing around the room and paper.
Give me a lighter.
Starts a series of small fires, assuming it will ignite the place. He's right, it does. Pretty soon it's fully involved, and they run.
So then we need someplace to stay.
And then they said, what are we going to do now?
So they wander off to another place where they've been, which is Blaine Thacker's house. Blaine takes them in because he's a nice man. Dale snaps again.
Dale just took matters into his own hands, knew that he needed financial resources to either get out of town or get where he needed to go, and killed Mr. Thacker and then stole from him as well.
Was that you and Jennifer's plan all along?
Nah. She didn't know any of that was gonna happen.
Dale knew Jennifer had been arrested and confirmed her statements that her responsibility was not as great as his. Jennifer Smith decided to plead guilty to avoid trial, and her sentence was a 10-year sentence to serve.
Dale pleads guilty, and he's sentenced to life in prison. What does he do with that? Well, he engages in pen pals for criminals. I'm sure he tells them he lives in a gated community. You know, like a prison. Good Lord.
He may have pled guilty just to avoid the death penalty, but he's showed no remorse or nothing for these victims. He could care less.
I'm happy he's in jail. I don't know that there's ever really justice. I mean, it's not going to bring Blaine back. It's not going to bring Eddie back. And their lives were cut short for what?
These guys couldn't have been more innocent a victim as they get. I just think they were victims of opportunity and victims of opening their home to the wrong person. I think Dale was a con man, and he knew the power of his charm and what that could do for him.
Moneypenny inserts himself into people's lives. He's like a tick. He crawls on the surface of your skin and buries himself in it. He endears himself to you. He uses every ploy within his power to gain your trust, your attention, and your affection. And eventually he determines what you have that he might want. And if you resist that happening, then I'm sorry, you're going to have to die.
November 9th, 1971 began like countless other autumn mornings in the quiet town of Westfield, New Jersey. The trees that lined the streets had surrendered most of their leaves, painting the sidewalks in shades of rust, amber, and fading gold. A cold breeze drifted through neighborhoods where life followed an almost comforting routine. Cars disappeared down driveways toward offices in Newark and New York City. Children hurried toward school with backpacks bouncing against heavy coats. Dogs barked behind white picket fences. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell marked another ordinary Tuesday, its sound dissolving into crisp November air. Nothing about that morning suggested that one of America's most haunting family murders was already unfolding behind the elegant walls of a mansion known simply as Breeze Knoll. From the outside, the house looked almost timeless. Its dark roof stood high above the surrounding neighborhood. Large windows reflected gray skies. Stone chimneys stretched toward the clouds. It was the kind of house that made strangers slow their cars for a second glance. A place that seemed to promise warmth, tradition, and generations of family memories gathered around fireplaces during winter holidays. But houses can lie. Walls preserve silence better than people ever can. Inside Breeze Knoll, every room had become part of a plan that had existed for weeks, perhaps months. Every hallway, every staircase, every locked door would soon become pieces of a crime so methodically executed that investigators would spend years trying to understand not only how it happened, but why. There would be no frantic argument spilling into the street. No neighbors awakened by desperate screams. No shattered windows. No signs of chaos. Only silence. The kind of silence that settles over a home after every heartbeat inside it has been deliberately stopped. When police finally entered the mansion nearly a month later, they would find 5 bodies waiting exactly where one man had left them. Dust had settled across polished furniture. The heating system had been turned off, allowing the cold November air to preserve what remained. A religious hymn still echoed faintly from a record player that had long since fallen silent. Family photographs still smiled from shelves as if nothing had happened. The calendar remained frozen in time, abandoned in the middle of an ordinary week that never reached its end. Who could walk away from such a scene? Who could kill his own mother, his wife, and his 3 children, then calmly write letters, organize financial documents, clean the house, lock the doors, and simply disappear into another life? Those questions would haunt detectives for nearly 2 decades. But perhaps the most disturbing answer was not hidden inside forensic reports or courtroom testimony. It was hidden inside the mind of the man who believed he had done something necessary. John Emil List did not see himself as a monster. He did not flee in panic. He did not spend the next 18 years hiding in abandoned cabins or surviving under false identities in distant countries. Instead, he blended into ordinary American life. He found steady employment. He attended church. He smiled at neighbors. He remarried. The man who had erased his own family would spend years shaking hands, exchanging polite conversations, and living beside people who never imagined that one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives was standing only a few feet away. Perhaps that is what makes this case so enduringly terrifying. Evil does not always announce itself with rage. Sometimes it balances checkbooks. Sometimes it wears a pressed suit every morning. Sometimes it sits quietly in church. Sometimes it looks exactly like the man next door. For nearly 18 years, America searched for a ghost. His fingerprints existed. His military records existed. Photographs of his younger face sat inside police files across the country. Yet time became his greatest disguise. Hair turned gray. Wrinkles deepened. Eyeglasses changed. Names changed. Entire lives changed. And somewhere, investigators slowly accepted the possibility that they might never find him. The murders themselves were horrifying enough. 5 members of one family had vanished without explanation. Friends wondered why phone calls went unanswered. Teachers noticed children who never returned to class after an ordinary school day. Neighbors assumed the family had simply gone away. The mansion remained dark, its curtains drawn, becoming less a home and more a forgotten monument standing quietly at the edge of town. Life continued outside. Children laughed on bicycles. Snow arrived. Christmas decorations appeared. Another year came and went. Behind locked doors, time stopped forever. Cases like this force us to confront uncomfortable questions that have no easy answers. How well can we truly know the people closest to us? Can financial ruin slowly reshape a person's moral compass? Can faith become distorted until compassion is replaced by terrifying certainty? Or are there fractures inside certain minds that remain invisible until the moment everything collapses? These are not simple questions, and this story refuses to offer simple answers. Because this is not merely the story of a murder. It is the story of appearances. Of secrets maintained with remarkable discipline. Of a father who continued pretending everything was normal long after his world had begun collapsing behind closed doors. Imagine sharing breakfast with someone who already knows exactly how your day will end. Imagine hearing ordinary conversations while another person silently follows a schedule that no one else can see. Imagine believing your family is planning for Christmas while one member has already decided that none of you will live to see winter. That quiet certainty is more chilling than violence itself. Violence explodes. Planning whispers. And whispers are much harder to hear. Long before the first gunshot echoed through Breeze Knoll, another story had already begun unfolding. It unfolded in unpaid bills stacked neatly inside drawers. It unfolded in employment records hidden from loved ones. It unfolded in pride that refused to admit failure. It unfolded in religious convictions that slowly transformed into something darker, something detached from compassion and anchored instead in absolute control. Every lie demanded another lie. Every secret demanded another secret. Until eventually the truth became impossible to reveal without destroying the carefully constructed image of a successful husband and devoted father. So another solution emerged. One that existed only inside a mind isolated by fear, shame, and a profoundly distorted belief that death could somehow become an act of protection. History remembers murderers for many reasons. Some kill for money. Some kill for revenge. Some kill in uncontrollable moments of rage. John List occupies a uniquely unsettling place because his crime appeared almost administrative. Measured. Scheduled. Methodical. He approached the destruction of his own family with the calm efficiency of a man completing unpleasant but necessary business. That image has disturbed psychologists, criminologists, investigators, and ordinary readers for decades. Not because they found his reasoning convincing. They did not. But because understanding how someone reaches such conclusions forces us to examine the fragile intersection of belief, identity, responsibility, and choice. Every available piece of evidence shows that John List remained legally responsible for his actions. His financial difficulties, religious beliefs, and personal struggles do not explain away the murders or diminish their gravity. They form part of the background, not an excuse. 5 innocent people lost their lives because one man chose to carry out a meticulously planned act of violence. And yet, despite decades of investigation, interviews, documentaries, books, and courtroom records, one unsettling feeling continues to linger after the facts are laid bare. The greatest danger was never the gun. It was the ordinary face holding it. Before investigators pieced together timelines, before television broadcasts reached millions of viewers, before forensic artists aged an old photograph into the face of a fugitive nearly 20 years older, there was simply a family. A mother. A wife. 3 children. A dinner table. School schedules pinned to the refrigerator. Laundry waiting to be folded. Homework yet to be finished. Dreams extending quietly into a future that would never arrive. Those dreams ended not because of strangers breaking into a home, but because the person entrusted with protecting them had already decided that their story was over. This case has often been remembered as one of America's most infamous family annihilations. But behind every headline, every courtroom document, and every television reenactment are 5 lives that deserve to be remembered for more than the way they died. To understand what happened inside Breeze Knoll, we must first understand the illusion that surrounded it. The illusion of success. The illusion of stability. The illusion of perfect faith. And above all, the illusion that evil always looks unfamiliar. Because sometimes it wears a gentle smile. Sometimes it bows its head during Sunday prayers. Sometimes it kisses its children goodnight. And sometimes, before the sun rises on an ordinary Tuesday morning, it quietly decides that no one else in the house will ever wake to see another day. The story of what happened inside Breeze Knoll did not begin on the morning of November 9, 1971. Long before the first shot was fired, before detectives crossed the threshold of the mansion, before newspapers across the country carried headlines that stunned the nation, another story had been unfolding quietly beneath the surface. It was a story that looked, from the outside, remarkably ordinary. If someone had driven through the streets of Westfield during the late 1960s, they might have noticed the grand Victorian home sitting proudly on Hillside Avenue. Its towering structure overlooked the neighborhood with an almost stately elegance, as though it belonged to another era. Children often slowed their bicycles to admire it. Visitors passing through town sometimes asked about the enormous house that resembled something from an old American novel. To many residents, it was simply another landmark in an affluent community where families built comfortable lives, commuted to New York City, and expected tomorrow to look very much like today. Westfield itself embodied the American suburban dream. Tree-lined streets curved through neighborhoods filled with carefully maintained homes. Lawns were trimmed with precision. Families attended church on Sundays, gathered for little league games, and exchanged friendly greetings while collecting their morning newspapers. It was the kind of town where people believed they knew their neighbors well enough to recognize unfamiliar cars parked along the street. Doors were not always locked. Children walked to school without fear. Crime, when it occurred, usually involved little more than petty theft or youthful mischief. Against this peaceful backdrop stood Breeze Knoll, a mansion that seemed almost too magnificent for the quiet neighborhood surrounding it. Built decades earlier, the house contained more than enough space for a large family. Wide staircases connected multiple floors. High ceilings gave every room a sense of grandeur. Sunlight poured through tall windows during the day, casting long rectangles of light across polished wooden floors. A ballroom occupied one section of the home, a reminder of an era when lavish gatherings had once filled its halls with music and conversation. Although maintaining such a property required considerable expense, it projected an image of prosperity that few families in town could rival. For many who passed by, the List family appeared fortunate. They lived in one of the most recognizable homes in Westfield. Their children attended good schools. They participated in church activities. Their father held respectable employment as an accountant. Their lives seemed stable, structured, and rooted in traditional values. Appearances, however, have a remarkable ability to conceal slow-moving disasters. John Emil List had spent much of his life pursuing order. Born in 1925, he grew up during years shaped by economic uncertainty and global conflict. Like many men of his generation, military service became part of his identity. Discipline, routine, and personal responsibility were not simply habits but principles that guided nearly every decision he made. Those who knew him often described him as quiet rather than charismatic. He was not the loudest voice in a room. He rarely sought attention. He dressed conservatively, spoke carefully, and carried himself with a seriousness that some interpreted as dignity while others saw as emotional distance. Accounting suited him perfectly. Numbers behaved predictably. Columns balanced. Mistakes could be corrected through careful calculation. Life, unfortunately, offered no such certainty. John eventually married Helen, a woman whose personality contrasted with his reserved nature. Together they built a family that would eventually include 3 children, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick. Living with them was John's elderly mother, Alma, whose advancing age required increasing care and attention. To outside observers, the household represented multiple generations living under one roof, a picture of family unity that reflected traditional values admired by many Americans at the time. Yet even in those earlier years, subtle cracks existed beneath the polished surface. John's commitment to religion occupied a central place in his life. Faith shaped his routines, his moral outlook, and his understanding of responsibility. He attended church faithfully and expected his family to do the same. His beliefs influenced decisions about education, finances, and daily living. Religion, for him, was not merely one aspect of life. It was the framework through which every other aspect was interpreted. For countless people, faith provides comfort, compassion, resilience, and hope during hardship. In John's case, however, investigators and later observers would examine how his personal interpretations became increasingly rigid and isolated as pressures mounted around him. His beliefs did not cause the murders. Rather, they became intertwined with his own distorted thinking, creating a worldview in which impossible problems appeared to demand unimaginable solutions. Throughout the 1960s, the family's financial situation began to deteriorate in ways that remained largely invisible to neighbors. Maintaining Breeze Knoll consumed enormous resources. Heating such a large house during New Jersey winters was expensive. Repairs never seemed to end. Property taxes remained substantial. Every month required careful financial balancing. Then came the setbacks that John found increasingly difficult to acknowledge. Employment became unstable. Opportunities disappeared. Professional disappointments accumulated one after another. Eventually, he lost his job. Losing employment is a crisis faced by countless families, and the overwhelming majority respond by seeking new work, leaning on loved ones, or adjusting their circumstances without resorting to violence. For John, however, unemployment struck at the very core of how he understood himself. His identity rested heavily upon his role as provider, protector, and moral leader of the household. Without steady income, that carefully constructed identity began to unravel. Instead of telling his family the truth, he chose silence. Every morning he continued leaving the house as though he were still going to work. The routine remained almost unchanged. He dressed as usual. He departed at familiar hours. To anyone watching from across the street, nothing seemed unusual. Behind that routine, however, he spent his days searching for opportunities, managing mounting financial anxiety, and avoiding the conversation he feared most. Each evening he returned home carrying not the satisfaction of honest labor but the weight of another day spent preserving an illusion. The deception grew heavier with every passing week. Bills accumulated. Savings diminished. Debt increased. Yet inside the household, life continued according to schedules that no one questioned. Meals were prepared. Homework was completed. Church services were attended. Birthdays came and went. Conversations revolved around school, family plans, and ordinary concerns rather than the financial collapse quietly unfolding beneath them. To admit failure would require confronting shame. To continue pretending required increasingly elaborate lies. John chose the lies. There were moments when practical solutions remained possible. Selling the mansion could have reduced financial pressure. Downsizing to a smaller home might have provided a fresh start. Seeking support from relatives, friends, or religious leaders was another option. Many families facing severe hardship have rebuilt their lives through precisely those choices. But for John, selling Breeze Knoll represented more than moving to another address. It symbolized defeat. The mansion had become part of the identity he desperately struggled to preserve. Losing it meant acknowledging that the life he had worked to build no longer existed. Pride and fear formed a dangerous combination. Each prevented him from taking steps that might have exposed the truth but protected his family. As the months passed, isolation deepened. People experiencing overwhelming stress often withdraw from others. Conversations become shorter. Smiles become practiced rather than genuine. Ordinary questions begin to feel threatening because honest answers risk revealing painful realities. There is evidence that John increasingly carried these burdens alone. His family continued living beside him without fully understanding the scale of the crisis developing inside his mind. That hidden distance would become one of the most haunting aspects of the entire case. 5 people shared meals with him, prayed beside him, celebrated holidays with him, trusted him. Yet none appeared to realize how dramatically his private thoughts had begun separating from the world everyone else believed they occupied. Outside the walls of Breeze Knoll, Westfield remained blissfully unaware. Autumn arrived once again, covering sidewalks with fallen leaves and filling the air with the scent of wood smoke from neighborhood fireplaces. Storefront windows displayed seasonal decorations. Families prepared for Thanksgiving. High school football games drew enthusiastic crowds on cool Friday evenings. The rhythms of suburban America continued without interruption. Inside the mansion, another calendar was slowly taking shape. Not one marked by birthdays or holidays. One measured instead by deadlines, unpaid obligations, fading hope, and decisions that would ultimately alter countless lives forever. The transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, until the man who once balanced financial ledgers began trying to balance something infinitely more impossible, his collapsing sense of purpose against the lives of the people who trusted him most. By the autumn of 1971, the distance between appearance and reality had become wider than anyone outside the house could possibly imagine. The grand mansion still stood proudly above the neighborhood. The family name still carried respect. Church attendance continued. Daily routines appeared unchanged. Only one person knew that beneath every ordinary morning, every shared dinner, and every familiar smile, a plan was beginning to take shape, one that would soon transform Breeze Knoll from a symbol of family success into one of the most infamous crime scenes in American history. Before the headlines, before the photographs of Breeze Knoll appeared in newspapers across the country, before investigators reconstructed the final hours of the List family, there were 5 individual lives moving through ordinary routines, each carrying dreams, frustrations, habits, and quiet moments that would never make it into police reports. Murder has a way of reducing people to names on a page, ages beside photographs, and dates carved into stone. Yet the tragedy inside the mansion cannot be understood simply by counting the victims. Behind every room in that enormous house was a person whose story had been unfolding long before the violence that brought the family into history. Alma List was the oldest member of the household. At 84 years old, she had lived through events that reshaped the 20th century. She had witnessed economic depression, world wars, changing generations, and the slow transformation of America into a modern nation. Age had gradually limited her independence, and she now lived with her son and his family inside Breeze Knoll. Like many elderly parents who move into the homes of their adult children, she occupied a delicate place within the family dynamic. She depended on those around her, yet she also represented the traditions and values of an older generation. Her mornings followed familiar routines. Rising early had become a lifelong habit that never disappeared with age. Even as her health declined, there remained comfort in predictable rituals. Breakfast arrived at roughly the same time. Newspapers offered another connection to a world that seemed to move faster each passing year. Familiar rooms provided reassurance in a life increasingly shaped by physical limitations. To Alma, the mansion was not simply an impressive house. It was home, filled with the voices of grandchildren, footsteps echoing along wooden floors, and ordinary moments that made each day feel connected to the last. She could not have imagined that one ordinary breakfast would become the final chapter of a life spanning more than 8 decades. Helen List carried a very different burden. At 46, she stood at the center of the household, balancing responsibilities familiar to countless mothers. Meals needed preparing. Clothing needed washing. Schedules required coordination. The demands of raising teenagers while caring for an elderly family member rarely allowed moments of complete rest. Friends remembered her as someone who tried to maintain normalcy despite ongoing challenges. Like every family, the Lists experienced disagreements and pressures, but from the outside there was little to suggest the unimaginable violence waiting ahead. Life inside Breeze Knoll was not perfect. No family's life ever is. Large homes often create the illusion of comfort while quietly hiding financial and emotional strain. Bills arrived whether guests admired the architecture or not. Repairs became unavoidable. Heating enormous rooms during New Jersey winters consumed substantial resources. Maintaining appearances required constant effort. Yet Helen, like everyone else in the house, continued planning for tomorrow. There were groceries to purchase. Household tasks to complete. Conversations about school. Family obligations. The countless ordinary details that fill everyday life without anyone realizing how precious those routines truly are until they disappear forever. She did not know that her husband had been concealing the family's worsening financial reality for months. She did not know that each ordinary conversation unfolded beside thoughts she could neither see nor imagine. Trust is built upon the belief that those closest to us share the same reality. Inside Breeze Knoll, that shared reality had already begun to fracture long before anyone recognized the danger. Their eldest child, Patricia, stood on the threshold between adolescence and adulthood. At 16 years old, life stretched ahead with possibilities that only teenagers can fully believe in. School occupied much of her attention. Friendships evolved almost weekly. Like many young people growing up during the early 1970s, she belonged to a generation experiencing cultural change unlike anything their parents had known. Music, fashion, education, and social expectations all seemed to be transforming around her. Within the walls of Breeze Knoll, Patricia was more than simply the oldest daughter. She was a sister, a student, a young woman gradually discovering who she hoped to become. Family photographs captured moments that now seem heartbreakingly ordinary. Smiles during holidays, birthday celebrations, vacations. Images frozen forever before anyone understood how fragile those moments really were. Teenage years often include disagreements with parents, questions about independence, dreams of college, and hopes for a future beyond childhood. Whatever plans Patricia imagined for herself would remain forever unfinished. John List Jr., 15 years old, occupied another stage of adolescence. Old enough to form his own opinions. Young enough to remain deeply connected to family life. School, friends, hobbies, and everyday responsibilities filled his routine. Like many boys his age, he was navigating the uncertain transition between childhood and adulthood. The future likely seemed distant, something measured in graduation ceremonies, first jobs, and opportunities yet unseen. Nothing in the ordinary rhythm of his days suggested that those opportunities would never arrive. His younger brother Frederick, only 13, represented the youngest generation inside the mansion. Childhood still lingered in the way younger teenagers viewed the world. School assignments, games, conversations with siblings, and the reassuring certainty that parents would keep them safe remained central to everyday life. That assumption exists in nearly every family. Children believe adults will protect them. It is among the earliest forms of trust people ever experience. The betrayal of that trust is one reason family annihilation cases leave such lasting emotional scars. The violence does not arrive from strangers forcing their way through locked doors. It comes from within the very relationships built upon protection, love, and responsibility. Each member of the List family experienced Breeze Knoll differently. For Alma, it represented security during old age. For Helen, it was the center of family life. For Patricia, it was the home she would one day leave to build an independent future. For John Jr. and Frederick, it was simply where they laughed, studied, argued, celebrated birthdays, and fell asleep believing tomorrow would resemble today. Only one person inside the house viewed the mansion through an entirely different lens. For John, every room had become a reminder of failure. The soaring ceilings no longer reflected success but financial pressure. Every unpaid bill carried another weight upon his conscience. Every conversation with his children became increasingly complicated because it required maintaining a version of reality that no longer existed. Outwardly he remained calm, disciplined, and composed. Internally he was retreating further into isolation, constructing explanations that separated him from everyone else living under the same roof. The tragedy of the List family is not merely that 5 innocent lives ended. It is that those lives continued in complete confidence that they shared the same future. Imagine the ordinary moments filling those final weeks. A school lunch packed before sunrise. Homework spread across a dining room table. A grandmother settling into her favorite chair. A mother planning meals for the coming weekend. Teenagers discussing classes, sports, or upcoming holidays. Nothing about those scenes appears extraordinary. That is precisely why they matter. True tragedy rarely announces itself with dramatic warnings. It grows quietly beside routines so familiar that no one notices how quickly they could vanish. Neighbors remembered seeing members of the family carrying groceries, attending church, and moving through town like everyone else. Teachers interacted with the children in classrooms without suspecting that hidden tensions existed inside their home. Friends spoke with them about ordinary teenage concerns rather than life or death fears. No one realized they were witnessing the final ordinary days of 5 lives. There is a painful irony in examining family photographs after a crime. Every smile becomes a question. Every holiday gathering appears shadowed by knowledge that only the viewer possesses. Investigators often study such photographs searching for clues, expressions, hidden signs of conflict. Most of the time, they find nothing. Because photographs cannot capture private thoughts. They cannot reveal financial despair concealed behind polite conversation. They cannot expose beliefs slowly becoming distorted inside a single mind. They preserve appearances, not realities. The List family left behind the same ordinary evidence every family leaves. School records. Medical appointments. Church attendance. Birthdays marked on calendars. Receipts from neighborhood stores. Letters exchanged with relatives. Tiny fragments of everyday existence that suddenly became historical evidence once violence interrupted their lives. For investigators, those details later helped reconstruct timelines. For loved ones, they became treasured reminders of people remembered not for the way they died but for the lives they lived before November 1971. When discussing notorious crimes, it is easy to focus almost entirely on perpetrators. Their motives, methods, and personalities often dominate books, documentaries, and public fascination. Yet every minute spent examining the offender should be matched by remembering those whose futures were taken from them. Alma never reached another birthday. Helen never watched her children become adults. Patricia never discovered where adulthood would lead. John Jr. never had the chance to build a career, a family, or a life of his own. Frederick never grew beyond the uncertain years of adolescence. 5 different futures ended inside the same house. 5 different stories stopped before their natural conclusion. And perhaps the most heartbreaking truth is that none of them understood the danger surrounding them. They trusted the home they lived in. They trusted the routines that had defined their lives for years. Most of all, they trusted the man who sat beside them at meals, attended church with them, and occupied the role that should have represented their greatest source of safety. In only a matter of days, those ordinary routines would be shattered forever. The familiar rooms of Breeze Knoll would no longer echo with conversations between generations, the laughter of children, or the quiet rhythm of family life. Instead, every hallway, every staircase, and every carefully furnished room would become part of one of the most chilling crime scenes in modern American history, forever transforming a family home into a place remembered not for the lives that flourished within it, but for the unimaginable silence that followed. By the morning of November 9, 1971, the plan that had existed only inside one man's mind was no longer a thought. It had become a schedule. Outside, Westfield awakened exactly as it always had. The air carried the unmistakable chill of late autumn. Fallen leaves drifted across quiet streets where children waited for school buses and neighbors exchanged brief greetings before beginning another workday. Nothing appeared unusual. No flashing lights interrupted the calm. No urgent phone calls echoed through the neighborhood. The world beyond Breeze Knoll continued moving with the quiet confidence of people who believed this Tuesday would end like every other Tuesday before it. Inside the mansion, time seemed to move differently. The house had always possessed a peculiar stillness. Its high ceilings and long hallways softened ordinary sounds, allowing footsteps to disappear into distant rooms. Morning light filtered through tall windows, illuminating polished wooden floors and antique furniture that had witnessed decades of family life. Dust floated gently through narrow beams of sunlight. Somewhere inside the house, a clock continued marking each passing second with mechanical precision, unaware that those seconds were carrying an entire family toward the final hours of their lives. Nothing about the rooms themselves had changed. The dining table still stood where it always had. Family photographs remained arranged neatly on shelves and mantels. Coats waited beside the front entrance. Schoolbooks rested where they had been left the previous evening. The ordinary details of domestic life remained untouched, creating an unsettling contrast with the irreversible decisions already made. One by one, members of the household moved through familiar routines without realizing those routines would never be repeated. There were the small gestures that define every family morning: the preparation for school, the expectation that everyone would return home later in the day, the quiet confidence that tomorrow's plans still mattered. Those moments were so ordinary that no one had reason to question them. For the victims, it was simply another Tuesday. For John List, it was the day everything he had imagined would become reality. Investigators would later conclude that the events unfolded over several hours rather than in a sudden outburst of anger. That distinction became one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire case. The evidence pointed not to an impulsive act driven by immediate emotion, but to a sequence of deliberate decisions carried out over the course of the day. Between those moments were periods of waiting, of silence, of ordinary time continuing to pass inside the house. Outside, life went on. Cars traveled along Hillside Avenue. Children attended classes. Businesses opened their doors. Churches prepared for evening activities. No one passing Breeze Knoll could have imagined what had already begun unfolding beyond its walls. As the hours progressed, the atmosphere inside the mansion changed in a way no outsider could see. Rooms that had always represented safety became places of unimaginable loss. The home that had sheltered 3 generations of one family was transformed forever, not through chaos or destruction, but through an almost unbearable silence that gradually settled over every floor of the house. That silence would become one of the defining characteristics of the case. There were no desperate neighbors rushing toward the property. No crowd gathering outside. No immediate discovery that brought emergency responders racing through the front gate. Instead, the house remained closed to the world, preserving its terrible secret behind locked doors and drawn curtains. After the violence had ended, John List did something investigators and psychologists would later examine with profound unease. He remained inside the house. Rather than fleeing immediately, he moved through familiar rooms with remarkable composure. The evidence suggested that he took time to organize parts of the home, attend to practical matters, and prepare for his departure. To detectives, these actions reflected an extraordinary level of planning and emotional detachment. They were not the behavior of someone acting in panic. They indicated a person who believed there was still work to complete before leaving forever. One of the most haunting details was the care taken to shape what would happen after he disappeared. The heating system was turned off, slowing the natural changes that would otherwise occur inside the house during the coming weeks. Financial matters were addressed. Personal documents were handled. Certain records were cancelled or removed. These were not random actions. Together they formed part of a larger effort to close one chapter of life before beginning another under a different identity. Perhaps the most unsettling image left behind was not physical evidence at all. It was the presence of religious music. At some point before leaving, John List set sacred hymns to play inside the otherwise silent mansion. Whether he intended the music as a personal ritual, an expression of his beliefs, or something else entirely remains impossible to know with certainty. What investigators encountered weeks later was the memory of a home where faith had once been central to family life, now permanently associated with profound tragedy. He also left behind letters explaining his actions. Those writings would later become central pieces of evidence during the investigation and subsequent trial. In them, he attempted to justify decisions that the justice system and society as a whole recognized as inexcusable. His explanations revealed how deeply his thinking had diverged from reality. They reflected beliefs shaped by fear, shame, financial collapse, and a profoundly distorted interpretation of his religious convictions. None of those factors excused what had happened. Instead, they illustrated the dangerous distance that had developed between his private reasoning and the moral reality shared by everyone else. When he finally walked out of Breeze Knoll, he did not leave behind a scene of obvious disorder. The doors were secured. The house stood quietly against the grey November sky. To anyone passing by, it remained exactly what it had appeared to be the day before, an impressive Victorian mansion occupied by a respectable family. That illusion would endure far longer than anyone expected. Days passed. Mail accumulated. Newspapers collected near the entrance. Neighbors noticed little at first. Families traveled. Vacations happened. Busy schedules often kept people from seeing one another for days at a time. The absence of activity inside Breeze Knoll seemed unusual only gradually, becoming more noticeable with each passing week. Teachers eventually recognized that the List children had not returned to school. Friends wondered why phone calls went unanswered. Concern spread slowly rather than all at once, carried by small observations that seemed insignificant individually but deeply troubling when combined. Even then, few imagined the truth. Most assumed illness. Perhaps an unexpected family emergency. Maybe an unannounced trip. The possibility that an entire household had vanished under such horrifying circumstances felt almost unimaginable in a town like Westfield. That assumption delayed discovery. For nearly a month, the mansion remained sealed in silence. Autumn gave way to colder weather. Wind swept fresh leaves across the driveway. Nights grew longer. The neighborhood prepared for Thanksgiving while Breeze Knoll stood motionless, its windows reflecting changing skies without revealing the secret hidden inside. It is difficult to comprehend how an entire family could disappear so completely in a suburban community. Yet in 1971, communication moved differently than it does today. There were no mobile phones, no social media updates, no instant messages revealing daily routines. People could pass days or even weeks without immediate contact, particularly if explanations seemed plausible. John List understood that reality. His preparations exploited it. By the time concern finally reached local authorities, valuable weeks had already passed. What officers would eventually discover inside the mansion would shock even experienced investigators. The carefully maintained appearance of the house concealed one of the most devastating family annihilations in American history. Every room told part of the story. Every untouched object seemed to emphasize how abruptly ordinary life had ended. The tragedy of November 9th was not confined to the hours in which the crimes occurred. Its consequences stretched forward through weeks of silence, years of unanswered questions, and decades of public fascination. Families across America struggled to understand how a father could conceal such despair, how appearances could remain so convincing, and how a respected member of the community could disappear without a trace. For Westfield, the events permanently altered the town's sense of security. Residents who had once believed terrible things happened somewhere else found themselves confronting a painful truth. Sometimes the greatest danger is not the stranger no one recognizes. Sometimes it is hidden behind the familiar front door everyone passes without a second glance. And while Breeze Knoll still stood against the cold November sky, unchanged from the outside, everything that had once made it a family home had vanished, leaving only silence behind locked doors and a mystery that had yet to be uncovered. When the front door of Breeze Knoll finally opened in early December, the mystery did not become clearer. It became deeper. The first officers expected to find a family that had left town without notifying anyone. Perhaps there had been an emergency. Perhaps illness had forced them to stay with relatives. Every possibility seemed more reasonable than what waited inside the mansion. Within minutes, those assumptions disappeared. The house itself offered almost no immediate explanation. Furniture remained neatly arranged. Curtains hung undisturbed. Kitchen cabinets still held dishes exactly where they belonged. Nothing suggested a hurried escape. Nothing suggested a burglary. Nothing suggested the violent intrusion investigators so often associated with multiple homicide scenes. Instead, they found order. That order became one of the most unsettling pieces of evidence. Experienced detectives knew that chaos often follows violence. Forced entry leaves broken locks. Robberies leave drawers overturned. Desperate struggles leave shattered furniture and scattered belongings. Breeze Knoll offered none of those familiar signs. Every room seemed frozen in time, as though its occupants had simply paused their lives and never returned. The silence was overwhelming. The heating system had long since been turned off, allowing the cold New Jersey air to preserve the interior. Dust had begun settling over polished surfaces. Calendars remained open to dates that no one would ever cross off. Coats still hung beside the entrance. Schoolbooks waited where students had last placed them. It was not simply a crime scene. It was an abandoned life. Investigators moved carefully through the enormous house, documenting every room before disturbing anything. Each photograph captured the strange contradiction confronting them. Everything looked normal. Nothing was normal. The first question facing detectives was deceptively simple. Who could have done this? At first glance, several possibilities emerged. Could someone have targeted the wealthy family during a robbery? Had a business dispute escalated into deadly violence? Was there someone outside the family carrying a personal grudge? The size of the mansion complicated matters. Breeze Knoll contained numerous entrances, multiple floors, and enough space that reconstructing every movement would require painstaking attention. Detectives began exactly where investigators always begin. They searched for evidence of strangers. Doors. Windows. Locks. Footprints. Anything indicating forced entry. They found remarkably little. There were no broken locks. No smashed windows. No convincing evidence that an unknown intruder had fought his way inside. That absence immediately shifted attention toward another possibility. Someone had either been welcomed into the home, or had already belonged there. The realization changed the direction of the investigation almost overnight. Friends, neighbors, relatives, church members, teachers, and co-workers were interviewed one after another. Each conversation added another small piece to the puzzle. The responses sounded remarkably similar. The List family was quiet, private, religious, respectable. John List was consistently described as disciplined, polite, and reserved. He attended church faithfully. He dressed conservatively. He spoke calmly. Few people remembered arguments or emotional outbursts. If investigators had relied solely upon those descriptions, he might have seemed one of the least likely people capable of such extraordinary violence. Yet another troubling fact soon emerged. John himself was missing. His wife was gone. His children were gone. His elderly mother was gone. And so was he. At first, detectives hesitated to draw immediate conclusions. Perhaps he had been kidnapped alongside the rest of the family. Perhaps he had escaped and was injured somewhere. Perhaps he had become another victim whose body had not yet been located. Every possibility remained open. But as the investigation expanded, those possibilities narrowed. The family car was gone. Financial activity revealed unusual patterns. Certain accounts had been deliberately closed. Documents appeared to have been organized before the disappearance. Rather than pointing toward an unexpected attack, the evidence suggested preparation. Preparation required planning. Planning required time. And time implied intention. Investigators began reconstructing John List's final known movements before the murders. Co-workers provided surprising information. He had not actually been reporting to work. Months earlier, he had lost his job. The revelation stunned detectives. Even more surprising was the fact that many members of his own family apparently never knew. For weeks, perhaps months, John had continued leaving home each morning dressed for work, maintaining the illusion that everything remained normal. That discovery fundamentally changed investigators' understanding of the case. Hidden financial collapse. Secret unemployment. Growing debt. An expensive mansion becoming impossible to maintain. The perfect family image suddenly began cracking apart. One detective later remarked that solving major cases often resembles assembling a puzzle whose pieces arrive in the wrong order. This investigation proved exactly that. Each interview uncovered another concealed truth. Bills had accumulated. Mortgage pressures increased. Financial obligations multiplied. Yet outward appearances remained remarkably intact. The contrast fascinated investigators. How could someone maintain such convincing normality while privately facing overwhelming failure? Psychologists consulted during later stages of the case would suggest that preserving appearances had become almost as important to John as solving the financial crisis itself. Admitting defeat meant admitting that the identity he had carefully built over decades was collapsing. That possibility, however, explained only motive. It did not answer the larger question. Where was John List? His disappearance transformed the investigation into a nationwide search. Photographs were distributed. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states received bulletins. The Federal Bureau of Investigation joined the effort. Airports, bus terminals, railway stations, hotels. Every lead received attention. Yet nothing produced results. Weeks became months. Months became years. The trail simply ended. There were occasional sightings. Someone believed they had seen him buying gasoline. Another caller insisted he had boarded a train. Anonymous tips arrived from different states, each sounding convincing for a few hours before collapsing under investigation. Every false lead consumed valuable time. Every disappointment reminded detectives how completely one man had vanished. As the years passed, newer investigations naturally demanded attention. Detectives retired. Personnel changed. Filing cabinets filled with reports documenting interviews, financial records, forensic findings, and countless dead ends. The List case slowly transformed from an active manhunt into one of America's most frustrating unresolved homicide investigations. Still, not everyone gave up. Some investigators returned repeatedly to one troubling question. People do not simply disappear. Not forever. Someone, somewhere, knew John List. Someone had hired him. Lived beside him. Attended church with him. Spoken to him. The challenge was not whether he still existed. The challenge was discovering what name he had chosen to live under. For nearly 18 years, that single unanswered question would haunt investigators. They possessed fingerprints, military records, family photographs, financial history, even a detailed understanding of the crimes themselves. What they lacked was the one thing that mattered most. A face that matched the passing of time. And without that face, one of America's most wanted fugitives continued living an ordinary life, hidden not by sophisticated criminal networks or international escape routes, but by something far simpler. He disappeared into normality. The investigation had uncovered the truth about what happened inside Breeze Knoll. Finding the man responsible would prove to be an entirely different challenge. The November air had grown noticeably colder by the time concern surrounding Breeze Knoll could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. What had first seemed like an unusually quiet household was becoming something else entirely. Newspapers remained untouched near the entrance. Mail continued to disappear through the brass slot in the front door, collecting somewhere inside the house. Curtains stayed drawn. No lights appeared in the windows after sunset. The grand Victorian mansion that had once projected warmth and stability now stood like a silent monument overlooking Hillside Avenue, detached from the rhythm of the neighborhood around it. At first, no one imagined the worst. Families left town without informing every neighbor. Business trips happened. Emergencies arose unexpectedly. In 1971, weeks could pass without constant communication. There were no mobile phones, no social media posts, no instant messages assuring friends that everything was fine. Life allowed for absences that today would seem unusual. But eventually, small observations began connecting. Teachers noticed that Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick had not returned to school. Their unexplained absence stretched beyond what illness could reasonably explain. Classmates wondered where they had gone. Administrative staff attempted to reach the family, but every effort ended in silence. Neighbors experienced similar uncertainty. The house remained dark. No vehicles appeared in the driveway. No familiar faces emerged to collect newspapers or rake the growing carpet of autumn leaves gathering across the property. Each observation, taken alone, meant little. Together, they formed a pattern that became impossible to ignore. Someone finally contacted the authorities to request a welfare check. When officers arrived at Breeze Knoll in early December, the mansion appeared almost exactly as it had for weeks. The driveway was quiet. The grounds showed no signs of recent activity. Cold wind carried dry leaves across the stone walkway leading toward the entrance. Towering windows reflected a grey winter sky, revealing nothing about the secret hidden behind them. Standing outside, there was no obvious indication that the house had become the scene of one of the most devastating family murders in modern American history. The front door did not immediately reveal its secrets. Investigators entered cautiously, expecting uncertainty but not yet understanding the scale of what awaited them. Almost immediately, something felt wrong. The silence inside the mansion possessed an unnatural quality. Large homes are rarely completely quiet. Heating systems hum. Clocks tick. Floors creak as temperatures shift. The ordinary sounds of domestic life create a background that people rarely notice until it disappears. Inside Breeze Knoll, that background had vanished. The heating system had been turned off weeks earlier. Cold air filled the enormous rooms. Dust had begun settling across polished furniture. Time itself seemed suspended. As officers moved deeper into the house, they noticed that nothing appeared disturbed. Furniture remained perfectly arranged. Curtains hung neatly. Books rested on shelves. Family photographs still occupied their places on tables and mantels, smiling back at investigators with heartbreaking normality. There were no shattered windows. No overturned chairs. No obvious evidence of forced entry. It looked less like a violent crime scene than a home whose occupants had simply walked away. Then the illusion ended. Investigators discovered the bodies of the family, gathered together in one area of the house where John List had deliberately placed them after the killings. The sight transformed the investigation instantly. What had begun as a welfare check became a homicide investigation involving 5 victims. Even experienced detectives found the scene profoundly unsettling. Not because of chaos. Because of its absence. The arrangement of the scene suggested intention rather than panic. It reflected planning, control, and deliberate choices made after the violence had already occurred. Detectives immediately recognized that whoever had committed these murders had not fled impulsively. Significant time had been spent inside the house afterward. Every observation reinforced that conclusion. The house had been secured. Important documents appeared to have been organized. Certain financial records had been handled before the suspect left. Nothing indicated a hurried escape. Forensic specialists began the meticulous process of documenting every room. In 1971, crime scene technology lacked many of the sophisticated tools available today. There was no DNA profiling to identify unknown suspects. Digital reconstruction did not exist. Every photograph, fingerprint comparison, handwritten note, and physical observation carried enormous importance. Investigators worked methodically. They measured distances, recorded the position of objects, collected fingerprints, examined personal belongings. Every seemingly insignificant detail had the potential to answer critical questions later. Among the most significant discoveries was a series of letters left behind by John List. Rather than attempting to conceal his identity, he had left written explanations addressed to both family members and his pastor. The letters acknowledged responsibility for the murders while attempting to justify them through his own distorted reasoning. He described overwhelming financial problems and expressed the belief that he was protecting his family from future suffering by ending their lives before they could experience moral or spiritual decline. For investigators, the letters provided immediate evidence regarding identity and motive. For psychologists who would later study the case, they offered a disturbing glimpse into the way John had reframed reality within his own mind. The writings did not reflect confusion about what he had done. They reflected certainty. That certainty would later become one of the defining characteristics of the case. Another detail left investigators deeply unsettled. Religious music had been playing inside the house before eventually stopping when the record reached its end. The image remained unforgettable for many involved in the investigation: a silent mansion, family photographs still displayed throughout the home, written confessions resting nearby, and the lingering awareness that sacred hymns had accompanied the final hours before the killer walked away forever. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Faith had occupied an important place within the List household. Yet the beliefs expressed in John's letters represented his own personal interpretation rather than accepted religious teaching. During later court proceedings and public discussion, numerous religious leaders emphasized that his actions stood in direct opposition to the values he claimed to defend. Outside the mansion, word spread quickly. Westfield had never experienced anything remotely comparable. Police vehicles gathered near the property. Curious residents watched from a respectful distance, struggling to understand why so many officers had arrived at the town's most recognizable home. Rumors spread faster than confirmed facts. Some believed there had been a tragic accident. Others whispered about organized crime. A few wondered whether the entire family had become victims of an unknown intruder. As investigators continued processing the scene, one fact became increasingly impossible to ignore. John List was nowhere to be found. At first, detectives considered several possibilities. Perhaps he had also been killed elsewhere. Perhaps he had been abducted. Perhaps he had escaped after an attack by someone else. But the evidence inside the house steadily pointed toward a different conclusion. There were no indications of an outside struggle. No convincing evidence suggested that strangers had entered the mansion. Instead, the carefully organized condition of the house implied that someone familiar with every room had remained inside after the murders, carrying out deliberate tasks before leaving. Attention gradually shifted toward the missing father. That shift would ultimately reshape the entire investigation. Meanwhile, forensic examiners continued reconstructing the timeline. The condition of the house, combined with school attendance records, mail accumulation, and witness statements, indicated that the family had likely died weeks before discovery. The realization shocked investigators. For nearly a month, Breeze Knoll had concealed one of America's worst family murders while ordinary life continued uninterrupted just beyond its walls. Children had walked past the property on their way to school. Neighbors had driven by every morning. Autumn leaves had fallen across the lawn. Thanksgiving had come and gone. All while the truth remained hidden inside. The discovery left a lasting emotional impact on everyone connected to the case. Detectives later recalled not only the scale of the tragedy but also the profound stillness of the mansion. Unlike crime scenes marked by destruction and disorder, Breeze Knoll seemed preserved in time. Every untouched object reminded investigators how abruptly ordinary family life had ended. The calendars had stopped. The routines had stopped. 5 futures had stopped. Only the investigation had just begun. Within days, law enforcement agencies realized they were no longer searching for answers about what had happened inside the mansion. The evidence had already answered that question. Now they faced a far more difficult challenge. They had to find a man who had disappeared with remarkable preparation, leaving behind a carefully staged silence, a written confession, and one of the most haunting crime scenes the country had ever witnessed. The discovery inside Breeze Knoll had transformed a quiet suburban neighborhood into the center of a national investigation. The questions that had surrounded the empty house for weeks suddenly had answers, but those answers only created deeper mysteries. 5 members of the List family were dead. The man who should have been there to explain what happened was gone. John Emil List had vanished. For investigators, this was the beginning of a difficult and unusual search. Many homicide cases begin with a crime scene and a suspect list. Detectives work outward, searching for connections, motives, and opportunities. But the Breeze Knoll case presented a strange contradiction. The evidence inside the house strongly suggested who was responsible, yet the person they needed to question had disappeared before anyone realized a crime had occurred. The first hours after the discovery were filled with uncertainty. Detectives moved carefully through the mansion, attempting to understand not only what had happened but also how much preparation had gone into it. The scene did not resemble a crime committed in a moment of uncontrolled rage. There was no indication of a sudden confrontation between strangers. The home had been treated almost like a place being closed for an extended absence. That detail troubled investigators. A person who commits a crime in panic usually leaves behind panic. A person who commits a crime while overwhelmed by emotion often leaves behind evidence of that emotional storm. But Breeze Knoll told a different story. The person responsible had remained calm afterward. He had taken time. He had considered what needed to be done before leaving. The investigation quickly focused on the one person who had both opportunity and access, the missing husband and father. Yet investigators still had to answer an important question. What could drive someone like John List to commit such an unimaginable act? To those who knew him, the possibility seemed almost impossible. Neighbors described a quiet man who rarely attracted attention. He was not known for aggressive behavior. He was not the person people expected to see connected to a violent crime. He attended church. He maintained a respectable appearance. He was polite in conversation, even if somewhat distant. Many people who knew him struggled to reconcile the man they remembered with the crime scene inside Breeze Knoll. That contrast became one of the most disturbing aspects of the investigation. The community had not been looking at someone who appeared dangerous. They had been looking at someone who appeared ordinary. Investigators began interviewing everyone connected to the family. Relatives, friends, neighbors, church acquaintances, former co-workers. Each interview was an attempt to understand the hidden parts of John List's life. Gradually, a different picture began to emerge. Behind the image of stability was a man experiencing severe personal and financial pressure. One of the most important discoveries was that John had lost his job months earlier. The revelation surprised many people. He had continued leaving the house every morning as if he were still employed. He maintained the same schedule, the same appearance, and the same outward routine. The deception was remarkably consistent. For months, he had been living two separate lives. To his family and neighbors, he was still a working professional. Privately, he was facing unemployment, increasing debt, and the fear that the life he had built was collapsing. Investigators began examining financial records and discovered mounting pressure. The mansion that represented success had become an enormous burden. The costs of maintaining Breeze Knoll were significant, and the family's financial situation had become increasingly unstable. Yet John had refused to accept the reality that many families eventually face: sometimes a life must change. A smaller home. A different job. A new beginning. To investigators and psychologists who later studied the case, the issue was not simply money. It was identity. John List had built his entire sense of self around being a responsible provider. The idea of admitting failure appeared unbearable to him. Rather than allowing others to see his struggles, he concealed them until the pressure became overwhelming. However, understanding pressure was not the same as explaining murder. Thousands of people experience financial hardship. Thousands lose jobs. Thousands face disappointment and uncertainty. The overwhelming majority do not harm others. The investigation had to separate circumstances from responsibility. The circumstances helped explain the background. They did not justify the crime. As detectives reconstructed the final days before the murders, another troubling pattern emerged. John had been preparing for a future in which he would no longer exist as John List. The evidence suggested that his disappearance was not accidental. He had not simply driven away after a moment of fear. He had created distance between himself and his former life. Financial accounts had been addressed. Personal matters had been organized. The house had been left in a condition suggesting someone wanted to delay discovery. This meant investigators were not only searching for a missing person. They were searching for someone who had intentionally erased himself. The challenge became enormous. John List had no history of criminal behavior that would suggest where he might go. He did not appear to have connections to criminal organizations. He did not have a reputation as a reckless person. He was not the kind of fugitive investigators usually pursued. He was methodical, careful, patient, and perhaps most importantly, he understood how to blend into ordinary society. A nationwide search began. Authorities distributed information about him. His photograph appeared in law enforcement files. Tips arrived from the public. Every possible lead had to be investigated. But the trail repeatedly disappeared. Someone thought they saw him at a train station. Another person reported a possible sighting. Investigators followed each lead, hoping one would finally reveal his location. Again and again, they found nothing. The years passed. 1972 became 1973. Then 1974. Then the late 1970s. The case remained open, but the world continued changing around it. Technology advanced. Law enforcement methods evolved. New cases demanded attention. Detectives who had once spent countless hours searching for John List eventually retired or moved to other assignments. But the file remained. Inside it were photographs of a younger man who no longer looked like the person investigators believed they would eventually find. That became one of the greatest obstacles. Time was helping John List. Every year changed his appearance. Every year made old photographs less reliable. The man who disappeared in 1971 was not going to look the same if he was found in 1975, 1980, or 1988. Hair color would change. Facial features would age. Weight could fluctuate. A person could become almost unrecognizable while still living openly among others. And that possibility created a haunting question. What if John List was not hiding somewhere remote? What if he was simply living a normal life? That idea seemed almost impossible to accept. A man responsible for such a notorious crime should have been living in fear, investigators believed. He should have been isolated. He should have made mistakes. He should have revealed himself somehow. But John List did something far more difficult. He became invisible by appearing ordinary. The investigation slowly moved from searching locations to searching possibilities. Could he have changed his name? Could he have started over somewhere new? Could he have convinced an entire community that he was someone else? All of those possibilities seemed increasingly likely. The problem was finding evidence. For nearly 18 years, there was no major breakthrough. No confirmed sighting. No confession. No accidental discovery. Only an unanswered question that remained at the center of the case. Where was John List? And perhaps even more disturbing, who had he become? The answer would eventually come from an unexpected source, not through traditional detective work alone, but through the combination of media attention, modern forensic techniques, and one person recognizing a face that had been hidden for almost 2 decades. But before that breakthrough arrived, investigators had to endure years of uncertainty. Years of false leads. Years of wondering whether one of America's most wanted fugitives was still alive, somewhere, living the ordinary life he had stolen for himself. The search for John List had become a race against time. And time was winning. For nearly 18 years, the name John List existed in a strange place between memory and mystery. To law enforcement, he was not forgotten, but he had become something far more difficult to pursue, a missing man without a trail. The evidence inside Breeze Knoll had established what happened. The letters he left behind had removed much of the uncertainty surrounding responsibility. The investigators knew the person they were searching for. But knowing a name was not the same as finding a person. A photograph from 1971 showed a man frozen in time. A younger John List. Dark hair. A serious expression. A face belonging to a husband, a father, and a respected member of a suburban community before everything changed forever. But almost 2 decades had passed. People age. Faces transform. The person investigators wanted to find no longer looked exactly like the person they had been searching for. That was the advantage John List had unknowingly gained. Time had become his disguise. During those years, the case remained one of America's most disturbing unsolved family murder investigations. It was remembered by detectives, discussed by crime researchers, and occasionally revisited by journalists. The details remained shocking: a father who destroyed his own family, a carefully prepared disappearance, and a fugitive who seemed to have vanished completely. But as the years passed, public attention faded. New crimes replaced old headlines. New investigations occupied television programs. New fugitives appeared on wanted lists. The world moved forward. John List did too. He was no longer living as John Emil List. He had created a new identity. Under the name Robert Peter Clark, he managed to construct the ordinary existence he had once lost. He moved away from New Jersey, eventually settling in Virginia. He found work. He built relationships. He became part of a community that had no idea of the history hidden behind his carefully maintained appearance. To the people around him, he was simply another man. A neighbor. A co-worker. An acquaintance. Someone who attended social events and participated in everyday conversations. The extraordinary thing about his escape was not that he disappeared into isolation. It was that he disappeared into normal life. He did not hide in darkness. He lived among people. And for almost 18 years, that strategy worked. But cases like the List murders have a way of returning. Sometimes because of new evidence. Sometimes because technology catches up with old crimes. And sometimes because one person sees something that thousands of others missed. In 1989, the investigation received the opportunity it had been waiting for. The television program America's Most Wanted featured the case of John List. At the time, the program had become a powerful tool in helping law enforcement reach millions of viewers. It presented information about fugitives and asked the public to provide possible leads. The List case was ideal for the program's format. The crime was unforgettable. The suspect had vanished. And the mystery of how a man could disappear for nearly 2 decades captured national attention. But there was one major problem. The only widely available images of John List showed him as he appeared in 1971. How could viewers recognize someone almost 20 years older? The answer came from forensic artist Richard Norris. Using techniques designed to estimate how a person's face changes over time, Norris created an updated image of what John List might look like nearly 2 decades after the murders. The result was a face transformed by age but still carrying recognizable characteristics. The younger man from the old photographs became an older man. The hair had changed. The facial structure had matured. The expression appeared different. Yet the essential features remained. The image represented something more powerful than a drawing. It represented the possibility that the past could finally catch up. When the episode aired, millions of people across America saw the reconstructed face. Among them was someone who lived in Virginia. A neighbor named John Walsh recognized similarities between the image and a man living nearby. That man was known to him as Robert Clark. A seemingly ordinary neighbor. A man who lived quietly. A man no one suspected had a hidden history. The realization was shocking. The person investigators had spent nearly 18 years searching for had not been hiding in some unreachable location. He had been living a regular life. The tip was reported. Authorities investigated. The information was carefully examined. And slowly, the impossible possibility became reality. Robert Clark was not simply similar to John List. He was John List. The discovery represented one of the most remarkable moments in the history of fugitive investigations. A man who had escaped justice for nearly 2 decades was finally found, not through a dramatic police chase, not through a confession, and not through a mistake that exposed him. He was found because time itself had been turned into evidence. The age progression image had done what traditional photographs could not. It showed investigators and the public how the missing man might look, not how he had looked when he disappeared. On May 1, 1989, authorities arrested John List in Virginia. The moment marked the end of one of America's longest-running family murder manhunts. For investigators who had followed the case for years, it was a moment of closure. For the families and friends of the victims, it reopened painful memories that had never truly disappeared. The arrest also created a new wave of public questions. How had he lived so long without being recognized? How had neighbors, co-workers, and even people close to him failed to discover the truth? The answer was uncomfortable. John List had not survived by constantly running. He survived by convincing people that he belonged. He adopted a new name. He created a new history. He became the person those around him expected him to be. The same qualities that had once made him appear respectable now helped him remain hidden. His quiet personality became camouflage. His routine became protection. His ordinary appearance became his greatest advantage. But no identity built on deception can escape forever. Eventually, the past arrives. For John List, it arrived through a television screen, a reconstructed face, and a single person willing to make a phone call. After his arrest, the public fascination surrounding the case intensified. The country that had once searched for him now watched as the man behind one of America's most infamous crimes finally faced the justice system. The mystery of where John List had gone was over. The next question was more difficult. What would happen when he was forced to answer for what he had done? Nearly 2 decades after leaving Breeze Knoll behind, John List returned to public attention. The fugitive had been found. The missing father had become a defendant. And the quiet man who had spent years hiding behind another name would soon stand before a courtroom and face the consequences of a crime that had haunted an entire nation. After nearly 18 years of unanswered questions, the name John Emil List returned to the center of public attention. For almost 2 decades, he had existed as a mystery, a photograph on a wanted poster, a case file gathering years of unanswered questions. But now the man who had disappeared from Breeze Knoll was no longer a shadow. He was standing in front of the world again. Only this time, he was not a husband, a father, or a respected member of a suburban community. He was a defendant accused of destroying his own family. The arrest in 1989 marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that would force the justice system to examine not only what John List had done, but also the reasoning he offered to explain it. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The letters he left behind, the circumstances surrounding the murders, and his own disappearance all connected him directly to the crime. There was no longer a question of whether John List was responsible. The question was why. And that question would become the central focus of his trial. When John List entered the courtroom in 1990, many people who had followed the case for years were struck by the contrast between the man before them and the image they carried from 1971. The young accountant who had disappeared from New Jersey had become an elderly man. His hair had turned gray. His face showed nearly 2 decades of aging. The passage of time was visible in every feature. But behind that older appearance was the same person connected to one of the most disturbing family tragedies in American history. The courtroom became the place where 2 very different stories collided. The prosecution presented the story of a carefully planned crime. They argued that John List had not acted in a moment of uncontrollable emotion. Instead, they described a man who had made decisions over time, hidden his financial problems, prepared for his disappearance, and attempted to avoid accountability afterward. The evidence suggested preparation. Preparation suggested awareness. And awareness suggested responsibility. For the prosecution, the central argument was simple. John List had choices. He could have sold the mansion. He could have sought financial assistance. He could have admitted his struggles to family members. He could have asked for help. Instead, he chose a path that permanently ended 5 lives. The defense presented a more complicated picture. They did not deny that John List had committed the murders. Instead, they focused on his mental state at the time. They argued that he had been experiencing severe psychological distress and that his ability to think rationally had been deeply affected by his circumstances. The defense attempted to show the court the internal world of a man who believed he was making a terrible but necessary decision. However, the prosecution challenged that interpretation. They argued that his actions after the murders demonstrated awareness and control. He had written letters. He had organized personal matters. He had changed his identity. He had built a new life. Those actions, prosecutors argued, showed that he understood what he had done and understood that society would hold him accountable. The trial forced everyone involved to confront one of the most difficult questions in criminal justice. Can someone believe they are doing the right thing while committing an unforgivable act? The answer from the court was clear. A person's personal beliefs, no matter how deeply held, cannot erase responsibility for taking innocent lives. John List had created his own explanation for what happened. But the victims had no opportunity to give theirs. During the proceedings, the memories of Alma, Helen, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick remained at the center of the case. The courtroom was not only about the man who committed the crime. It was also about the people whose lives were taken away. They were not simply names in a legal document. They were a family. They had relationships. They had personalities. They had futures that should have continued. For the loved ones left behind, the trial represented a moment they had waited nearly 2 decades to reach. The arrest brought answers, but answers could not undo the loss. Time could reveal the truth, but it could not restore the birthdays never celebrated, the conversations never completed, or the years that should have followed. Justice in cases like this rarely feels complete. It can punish. It can acknowledge wrongdoing. It can establish responsibility. But it cannot reverse what happened. Throughout the trial, John List maintained much of the same reasoning that had appeared in his letters years earlier. He expressed that he believed he had acted out of concern for his family's future and spiritual well-being. Yet the courtroom did not accept that explanation as justification. The law viewed the victims differently. They were not problems to be solved. They were human beings with the right to live. That distinction separated John List's interpretation from the reality recognized by the justice system. After hearing the evidence, the jury reached its decision. John List was found guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder. The verdict brought legal closure to a case that had remained open for nearly 2 decades. The sentence reflected the severity of the crime. He received 5 consecutive life sentences. The judgment meant that although John List had successfully escaped justice for many years, he would spend the remainder of his life imprisoned. The man who had once walked away from Breeze Knoll and built a new identity would never again live as a free person. For investigators, the conviction represented the conclusion of a remarkable pursuit. For the community of Westfield, it closed a chapter that had remained painful for years. For the victims' loved ones, however, the verdict was not the end of grief. Loss does not disappear when a courtroom reaches a decision. A sentence cannot replace a mother. It cannot bring back a wife. It cannot return children to their families. Justice has limits. It can tell the truth. It can assign responsibility. But it cannot change the past. Following his conviction, John List spent his remaining years in prison. He occasionally spoke about the case, continued discussing his personal beliefs, and remained a subject of interest for researchers studying criminal psychology and family annihilation cases. Many people struggled to understand how someone who appeared so ordinary could commit such an extraordinary act. That question remained one of the most haunting elements of the case. John List was not remembered because he was a criminal mastermind. He was remembered because his crime shattered assumptions. It challenged the belief that danger always appears obvious. It demonstrated how deeply hidden personal struggles can become when someone chooses secrecy over seeking help. But above all, the trial reinforced a fundamental truth. No personal crisis, financial collapse, or distorted belief can justify destroying innocent lives. The courtroom did not erase the tragedy of Breeze Knoll. It did something else. It placed responsibility where it belonged. Nearly 20 years after 5 lives were taken, the man responsible finally faced the consequences of his actions. The search was over. The questions had been answered. But the story of John List did not end with the verdict. Because beyond the crime, beyond the investigation, and beyond the courtroom remained a deeper question that would continue to follow the case for generations. How should society remember tragedies like this? Should they be remembered only through the actions of the person who caused them? Or should the focus return again and again to the people whose lives existed before the tragedy? For Breeze Knoll, the answer is clear. The house became famous because of what happened there. But the people who lived inside it mattered because of who they were before that day. And that is where the final chapter of this story must begin. Nearly 4 decades have passed since the quiet streets of Westfield were forever changed by what happened inside Breeze Knoll. The mansion that once represented comfort, success, and family life became one of the most recognizable locations connected to a true crime case in American history. Yet behind the headlines, behind the investigations, and behind the fascination surrounding John List, there remains a much more important story. The story of 5 people whose lives ended far too soon. For many years, public attention naturally focused on the person responsible. His disappearance, his new identity, his capture, and his trial created a narrative filled with mystery and unanswered questions. People wanted to understand how someone could commit such an act, disappear for nearly 2 decades, and live among others while carrying such a terrible secret. But the danger of focusing too heavily on the perpetrator is that the victims can slowly disappear from the story. They become names. They become statistics. They become part of a timeline. And they deserve more than that. Alma List was more than an elderly woman who died inside a famous crime scene. She was someone who had lived through 8 decades of history. She had experienced a world that transformed dramatically during her lifetime. She had family memories, personal stories, and a place within the household that could never be replaced. Helen List was more than a wife whose life ended in tragedy. She was a mother who spent years caring for her children and building a home. She was a person with relationships, experiences, and hopes that existed long before the day her name appeared in newspapers. Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick were not simply the children of John List. They were young people with futures ahead of them. They had classrooms they attended, friends who knew them, dreams they had not yet discovered. The world never saw what they might have become. That is perhaps the deepest tragedy of family annihilation cases. The victims lose not only the years they had already lived. They lose every possibility that could have followed. Every graduation. Every career. Every friendship. Every relationship. Every ordinary moment that makes a life meaningful. Those futures ended inside Breeze Knoll, but their existence before that tragedy remains important. Over time, the house itself became a symbol. To some, it represented one of America's most disturbing crimes. To others, it represented a reminder that appearances can be misleading. A beautiful home does not guarantee a peaceful life. A successful image does not always reflect reality. A person who appears calm and respectable may still be carrying struggles that others cannot see. But understanding that reality requires balance. The circumstances surrounding John List's life have been studied extensively. Financial pressure, personal shame, isolation, and distorted beliefs all became part of discussions about how such a tragedy could occur. However, explanation is not the same as excuse. Many people experience financial hardship. Many people face failure. Many people struggle with fear, disappointment, or uncertainty. The vast majority seek solutions without harming others. The choices John List made were his own. The responsibility for the murders belonged to him. Remembering that distinction matters because it protects the dignity of the victims and prevents the focus from shifting away from the lives that were taken. The case also changed the way many people viewed investigations involving missing suspects. For nearly 18 years, John List remained hidden not because he had escaped to some unreachable place, but because he understood something simple about human nature. People tend to see what they expect to see. A neighbor expected to see a normal man. A coworker expected to see an ordinary colleague. A community expected to see someone who belonged. And for years, that expectation protected him. His capture became a landmark moment because it demonstrated the power of time, technology, and public involvement. The age progression image created by forensic experts transformed an old photograph into a possible glimpse of the future. A face that had once represented the past became a tool for finding the present. It was a reminder that even decades-old cases can still find answers. Even carefully constructed identities can eventually collapse. Even those who disappear completely can still be found. When John List died in prison in 2008 at the age of 82, the legal chapter of the case finally ended. There would be no further trial. No possibility of release. No opportunity to return to society. But the end of a criminal's life does not end the questions surrounding the crime. The story continues because it represents something larger than one individual. It forces society to examine the importance of communication, honesty, and recognizing when people are struggling beneath appearances. The tragedy of Breeze Knoll reminds us that silence can be dangerous. The financial problems John List hid did not disappear because he refused to acknowledge them. The shame he carried did not become smaller because he concealed it. Instead, secrecy allowed his thoughts to become increasingly detached from reality. That does not mean others were responsible for his actions. They were not. It means that hidden struggles can become more dangerous when they are never confronted, discussed, or addressed. The story also reminds us of the importance of seeking help during moments of crisis. Financial difficulties, emotional distress, and personal failure can create overwhelming feelings. But there are always alternatives to violence. There are always choices that preserve life rather than destroy it. John List believed he had reached the end of all possible solutions. He was wrong. There were other paths. There were other decisions. There were other futures. 5 people never received the chance to discover them. Today, the name John List remains associated with one of America's most infamous crimes. His actions continue to be studied by criminologists, psychologists, and investigators attempting to understand family violence and the warning signs that may exist before tragedy occurs. But the final lesson of Breeze Knoll should not be about the man who destroyed it. It should be about the people who lived there. A grandmother who deserved more years. A mother who deserved more memories. 3 children who deserved adulthood. Their lives were not defined by the way they died. They were defined by the years before that moment. The conversations they had. The people they loved. The small everyday experiences that make every human life valuable. The most haunting aspect of the John List case is not simply that a family was lost. It is that, for a time, the world outside continued as if nothing had changed. The streets remained quiet. The seasons changed. People went to work. Children went to school. Life continued. Meanwhile, inside one house, an entire family's future had ended. That contrast is what makes the case unforgettable. It reminds us that every home contains stories we may never know. Every person carries experiences invisible to others. And every ordinary day is built from moments that seem insignificant until they become memories. The tragedy of Breeze Knoll was not created by a single moment alone. It was the result of choices, hidden struggles, and a deeply distorted belief system that led one man to commit an irreversible act. But the ending of this story belongs not to him. It belongs to those who were lost. Because long after the headlines fade, long after investigations conclude, and long after courtrooms fall silent, the most important question remains the same. Who were the people behind the tragedy? They were not just victims. They were a family. They were individuals. They were lives that mattered. And they deserved to be remembered not because of how their story ended, but because of everything that came before. Years after the final courtroom proceedings ended, after the headlines faded and the television cameras moved on to other stories, Breeze Knoll remained as a place carrying the weight of memory. Some locations become famous because of beauty. Others become famous because of history. And some become remembered because something happened there that changed the way people see the world. Breeze Knoll belonged to the third category. The mansion was never just a building again. To people who knew the story, it represented a moment when the illusion of safety was shattered. It stood as a reminder that tragedy does not always arrive in unfamiliar places. Sometimes it happens behind familiar doors, inside neighborhoods where people wave to each other every morning and believe they understand the lives of those around them. The passage of time changed many things. The neighborhood changed. The people who remembered the events firsthand grew older. A new generation grew up without personal memories of the investigation, the news coverage, or the fear that spread through Westfield in 1971. But the story remained. Because some stories survive not because people want to remember them, but because they feel they need to understand them. The case of John List became part of a larger conversation about family violence, hidden struggles, and the dangers of maintaining appearances at all costs. For decades, investigators and researchers examined the warning signs surrounding the case. Not because they believed one simple explanation could solve the mystery. There was no single cause. No single moment. No single factor that could explain the choices John List made. Human behavior is far more complicated than that. But the case showed how dangerous it can become when a person becomes trapped inside a private reality that no one else can see. John List spent months hiding his unemployment. He hid his financial problems. He hid his fears. He hid the collapse of the identity he had spent his life creating. Every hidden problem became heavier. Every unanswered question became another burden. Until eventually, the world inside his mind became completely separated from the world everyone else inhabited. That separation was where the tragedy began. But the story of Breeze Knoll should never be interpreted as a story about inevitability. Nothing about the murders was unavoidable. At every stage, there were other choices available. There were other possibilities. There were ways forward that did not involve destroying innocent lives. That distinction remains essential when examining crimes like this. Understanding a person's background is not the same as excusing their actions. Exploring the circumstances behind a crime does not reduce the responsibility of the person who committed it. The victims remain the center of the story. Their absence is the greatest consequence. Their unfinished lives are the greatest loss. Over the years, the List case also became an example of how technology and public awareness can change investigations. In 1971, investigators had limited tools compared with modern forensic science. There was no instant database search, no digital communication network, no advanced facial recognition systems. Yet nearly 18 years later, the case found its breakthrough through a combination of persistence and innovation. A television program. A forensic artist. A reconstructed face. A single person who recognized something familiar. The capture of John List became proof that time does not always erase the truth. Sometimes it simply delays its arrival. For the families and friends of the victims, however, the discovery of the truth came with complicated emotions. Justice brought answers. But answers could not bring back what had been lost. A conviction could not restore birthdays that never happened. A prison sentence could not replace conversations that would never occur. A courtroom verdict could not repair the empty spaces left behind. Grief does not follow the same timeline as an investigation. Police cases eventually close. Court files are eventually archived. News stories eventually disappear. But for those who loved the victims, loss continues in quieter ways. It appears in old photographs. In memories of ordinary days. In moments when someone remembers a voice, a smile, or a small habit that belonged only to that person. Those are the details that keep people alive in memory. Not the crime. Not the headlines. Not the tragedy. The life before it. That is why remembering the List family matters. Because the danger of notorious crimes is that they can transform real people into symbols. A grandmother becomes a victim. A mother becomes evidence. Children become names in a case file. But they were never symbols. They were human beings. They laughed. They had routines. They had relationships. They had hopes. They deserved futures. The legacy of Breeze Knoll should not be defined only by what happened inside those walls. It should also be defined by what people learned afterward. That appearances can be misleading. That silence can hide suffering. That asking for help is a sign of strength, not weakness. That financial failure is temporary, but the consequences of violence are permanent. And perhaps most importantly, that no person has the right to decide whether another human being deserves to live. John List believed he was making a final decision for his family. History remembers something different. It remembers 5 people whose lives were taken from them. It remembers a community that was forced to confront an unimaginable reality. It remembers investigators who refused to let an old case disappear. It remembers that even after years of silence, the truth can still be found. Today, the name Breeze Knoll carries a dark association. But behind that darkness are reminders of something more important. Every family has a story beyond its worst moment. Every person deserves to be remembered beyond the circumstances of their death. And every life lost leaves behind a space that can never truly be filled. The story of John List ends with a prison sentence. But the story of the List family does not end there. It continues in memory. It continues in the people who loved them. It continues in the lessons taken from a tragedy that should never have happened. Because in the end, the most important question is not why one man chose destruction. The most important question is whether we remember the people who deserved so much more. And the answer must always be yes. Even after the courtroom doors closed, even after John List was sentenced, even after nearly every major question surrounding Breeze Knoll had been answered, one feeling remained. Unease. Some cases end with a clear conclusion. A suspect is identified. Evidence is presented. A verdict is reached. Society moves forward. But certain crimes leave behind questions that remain long after the legal process is complete. The John List case was one of those cases. Not because investigators failed. They succeeded. The truth was uncovered. The person responsible was found. Justice was delivered. Yet understanding what happened is not the same as understanding why it happened. And that difference is where the deepest questions remain. How could a man live for years believing he was a respectable husband and father while carrying the secret of what he had done? How could someone who appeared quiet, disciplined, and ordinary become responsible for an act so devastating? How could an entire community look at the same person for years and never recognize the truth hidden beneath the surface? These questions continue to surround the case because they challenge one of the most uncomfortable assumptions people often carry. The belief that dangerous people always look dangerous. John List did not fit the image many people expect when imagining someone capable of extreme violence. He was not known as a reckless person. He was not someone who openly displayed aggression. He did not create fear among those around him. Instead, he appeared controlled, predictable, respectable. And that contrast became one of the most disturbing elements of the case. The people around him were not necessarily blind. They saw the version of John List that he presented. They saw a man who attended church. A man who dressed carefully. A man who spoke politely. A man who seemed committed to his family. But they did not see the private world he had created inside his own mind. That hidden world was built from fear, shame, and a desperate need to preserve an image of success. For much of his life, John List measured himself through responsibility. Being a provider mattered to him. Being respected mattered to him. Being viewed as morally correct mattered to him. When those foundations began collapsing, he did not respond by accepting change. He responded by attempting to preserve the illusion. This became one of the central themes examined by those who studied the case. Not the idea that financial hardship creates violence. It does not. Millions of people face financial struggles without ever harming anyone. The important issue was how John List interpreted his circumstances. A financial problem became, in his mind, a personal and moral failure. A professional setback became a threat to his entire identity. A difficult situation became something he believed had no acceptable solution. That distorted thinking was not shared by those around him. It existed only within his own perception. And that is one of the most dangerous aspects of extreme personal beliefs. A person can become completely convinced of an idea that everyone else would recognize as deeply wrong. Inside that private reality, actions that should appear impossible can begin to seem justified. The tragedy is that reality does not change simply because someone believes it has. 5 innocent people still lost their lives. A family was still destroyed. A community was still traumatized. Another unanswered question surrounding the case involves the 18 years John List spent in hiding. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of his escape was not the disappearance itself. It was the ordinary nature of his new life. Many fugitives attempt to hide by avoiding society. John List did the opposite. He became part of society again. He found work. He interacted with neighbors. He developed relationships. He created routines. He lived the kind of quiet existence that allowed him to disappear in plain sight. This raises a difficult question about identity. How much of a person can change before they become someone else? A name can change. An address can change. A job can change. A person's appearance can change. But the past remains. For almost 18 years, John List carried a secret that connected him forever to Breeze Knoll. The world around him did not know. But he knew. Every ordinary day he experienced after the murders existed alongside the knowledge of what he had done. Whether he felt guilt, regret, or something else internally remains a complicated question. His statements throughout his life showed a consistent attempt to explain his actions through his own beliefs. Yet explanations and accountability exist in separate places. A person can explain why they made a choice. That does not remove responsibility for making it. Another question often discussed after the case is whether anyone could have recognized warning signs before the tragedy occurred. This question is difficult because hindsight changes everything. After a crime happens, every detail appears meaningful. Every conversation seems like a possible clue. Every behavior seems like a warning. But real life does not work that way. People do not have access to future events. They see only fragments. A quiet person may simply be quiet. A person experiencing financial stress may simply be experiencing financial stress. A person going through personal difficulties may recover and rebuild. Not every struggle becomes a tragedy. Not every unusual behavior predicts violence. The challenge is recognizing when ordinary human suffering crosses into something more dangerous. The List case also influenced discussions about family annihilation, a category of crime involving individuals who kill members of their own family. These cases are among the most emotionally devastating because they violate one of society's strongest expectations. Families are supposed to represent safety. Parents are supposed to protect children. Homes are supposed to be places of refuge. When those expectations are destroyed, the emotional impact reaches far beyond the immediate victims. It affects how people view trust itself. After Breeze Knoll, many residents of Westfield experienced a shift in perspective. The town had always felt safe. The neighborhood had represented stability. The tragedy introduced a painful reality. No community is completely untouched by human complexity. No appearance guarantees the truth. No address protects people from every possible danger. But the lesson should not be fear. The lesson should be awareness. Awareness that people can struggle silently. Awareness that asking for help matters. Awareness that maintaining appearances at the expense of honesty can create deeper problems rather than solving them. The final unanswered question may be the simplest one. How should we remember this case? Should it be remembered as the story of John List? Or should it be remembered as the story of the family he destroyed? The answer matters. Because history has a tendency to remember the person who committed the crime more vividly than the people who suffered from it. The criminal becomes famous. The victims become forgotten. But a true understanding of the case requires changing that focus. The List family existed before the tragedy. They had personalities. They had relationships. They had moments of happiness. They had ordinary days that mattered. Their lives were not simply the background of someone else's crime. They were the reason the crime mattered. Nearly 50 years later, the case remains disturbing not because it is mysterious anymore. The mystery has largely been solved. It remains disturbing because it reveals something uncomfortable about human nature. The distance between appearance and reality can sometimes be enormous. A person can hide pain. A person can hide failure. A person can hide secrets. But the existence of hidden struggles does not mean tragedy is unavoidable. Choices still matter. Actions still matter. Responsibility still matters. The story of Breeze Knoll is ultimately a reminder that behind every headline are real people. Behind every investigation are families searching for answers. Behind every crime scene are lives that existed before the tragedy. And behind every case remembered through history is a responsibility to tell the story carefully. Not to glorify the person who caused the harm. Not to become fascinated only by the darkness. But to remember what was lost. The final image of this case should not be a man disappearing into another life. It should not be a courtroom photograph. It should not be a wanted poster. It should be a family. A grandmother. A mother. 3 children. 5 lives that deserved more time. 5 stories that ended too soon. And a reminder that the most important part of any true crime story is not the person who created the tragedy. It is the people whose lives were changed forever because of it.